Healing from narcissistic abuse is not like healing from an ordinary difficult relationship. The specific tactics involved in narcissistic relationships, intermittent reinforcement, gaslighting, idealization and devaluation, projection, and the deliberate targeting of your self-concept, create a particular kind of internal damage that requires a particular kind of approach to repair. If you have been trying to heal using the tools that work for ordinary heartbreak and finding that they are not quite reaching it, this video will help explain why and what actually helps. Anna Lembke at Stanford University School of Medicine, whose research on addiction and dopamine has become foundational in understanding why some patterns are so hard to leave, has shown that narcissistic relationships create a neurological bond that is structurally similar to substance addiction. The intermittent reinforcement, the unpredictable alternation between warmth and coldness, activates the same dopamine reward circuitry that gambling does. And like gambling, the periods of deprivation make the rare rewards neurologically supercharged. This is why you may find yourself missing someone who treated you badly, not because the love was wrong, but because your brain was conditioned into an addictive relationship with the unpredictability itself. Leon Festinger at Stanford University is best known for his research on cognitive dissonance, the psychological discomfort that arises when we hold to contradictory beliefs simultaneously in a narcissistic relationship. Cognitive dissonance is not accidental. It is systematically induced through double binds, contradictory demands, gaslighting, and the alternation between being treated as special and being treated as worthless. Over time, your mind becomes trained to override its own clear perceptions in order to maintain the relationship and the narrative the abuser requires. The result is a kind of internal noise, a background static of confusion and self-doubt that does not simply stop when you leave. Heinz Kohut at the Chicago Institute for Psychoanalysis developed a framework for understanding how narcissistic personalities defend against their own shame by projecting it outward. What this means practically is that the criticisms, comparisons, and dismissals you received were not accurate assessments of who you are. They were the abuser's own disowned self-hatred being redirected at you. The particular cruelty of this mechanism is that it is often delivered with such conviction and repetition that you began to absorb it as fact. Distinguishing what is genuinely yours from what was placed there by someone else's pathology is a central task of healing. Bessel van der Kolk at Boston University has written about how living with someone whose moods are unpredictable and whose emotional responses are disproportionate trains your nervous system into a state of chronic low-level threat. You learn to read microexpressions, tonal shifts, and environmental cues as early warning signals, and that scanning became automatic. The problem is that this hypervigilance does not deactivate when the threatening person leaves. The nervous system continues its surveillance, now triggering in response to sounds, tones, and social dynamics that remind it, below the level of conscious awareness, of the conditions where it first learned to be afraid. This is not anxiety in the ordinary sense. It is a survival adaptation doing exactly what it was trained to do. Dan Siegel at UCLA has written about how identity forms through interpersonal integration, the way our sense of self is co-constructed through the relationships we inhabit. When a relationship systematically fragments your identity through shifting expectations, criticism, and devaluation, you can emerge from it without a stable sense of where your edges are. You may find that different situations activate very different versions of you: a pleasing version, a shrinking version, an angry version, a numb version. These are not character disorders. They are adaptive responses that were developed in an environment that required constant self-modification, and they can be recognized, understood, and gradually integrated into a more coherent sense of who you actually are. One thing that delays healing for many people is the search for closure directly from the person who caused the harm. It makes emotional sense to want the abuser to acknowledge what happened, to validate your experience, to offer a genuine account of what was real. But the same defensive architecture that generated the abuse also makes that kind of honest accounting extremely unlikely, if not impossible. Waiting for acknowledgement that will not come keeps your healing tethered to someone who already demonstrated they cannot offer what you need. The closure you need will come from your own process, not from theirs. There is actually a 3D game called Inner Phoenix, where you can walk through quiet rooms designed around these exact ideas, and many people healing from narcissistic abuse find it a genuinely useful companion during the parts of recovery when the work feels too heavy to hold alone. Complete no contact is not simply a strategy for the relationship. It is a neurological necessity for breaking the addictive bond that Lembke's research describes. Every contact, even indirect contact, resets the detoxification process. The dopamine system needs sustained absence of the addictive stimulus in order to begin recalibrating its sensitivity. Every time you check their social media, receive a forwarded message from a mutual friend, or allow any form of connection to continue, you are not simply prolonging the grief. You are restarting the neurochemical addiction cycle from a point that is earlier than you left off. Full disconnection is an act of neurological self-care, not avoidance. The first weeks of no contact often feel like a worsening of symptoms rather than an improvement, and this is important to understand before you live through it. Stephen Porges at Indiana University explains that when the nervous system has been trained to find its regulation through contact with a specific person, even a harmful one, removing that contact initially creates dysregulation. The body goes into a kind of withdrawal. Sleep becomes difficult, concentration fractures, physical symptoms can appear. This is not evidence that you need to go back. It is evidence that the addiction was real and that the detoxification is genuinely working. The discomfort is neurological recovery, not deterioration. Restoring trust in your own perceptions is a gradual and specific practice, not something that returns on its own simply because the gaslighting has stopped. A practical approach is to begin recording your immediate reactions to situations before you analyze or second-guess them. Write down what you noticed, what you felt, what your body registered. Over time, as you accumulate evidence that your perceptions are reliable, as your predictions align with outcomes and your instincts prove accurate, the confidence in your own cognitive and emotional experience begins to rebuild. You are not seeking certainty about everything. You are rebuilding the basic trust that your direct experience is a legitimate source of information about reality. One of the most disorienting aspects of recovering from narcissistic abuse is encountering your own inner critic and realizing that it does not entirely belong to you. Many survivors notice that their self-critical voice uses the same language, the same comparisons, the same accusations as the abuser. Heinz Kohut's work at the Chicago Institute for Psychoanalysis helps explain this. The voice you absorbed is not your authentic self-assessment. It is an introjected version of the abuser's projections, installed through repetition. A useful practice is to ask, when the inner critic speaks, does this criticism reflect my actual values and experience? Or does it sound more like something I was told? If this video is describing something you have been through or something you are currently navigating, and it is helping to have the neuroscience name what you have been experiencing, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. These concepts are part of a series that builds toward a more complete picture of recovery, and there are videos that directly address many of the specific questions that come up at each stage. You are not alone in this. Stay with it. The body carries narcissistic abuse in specific ways that purely cognitive approaches do not fully reach. The hypervigilance lives in the shoulders and the jaw. The freeze response lives in the chest. The habitual appeasement lives in the throat. Peter Levine, who developed somatic experiencing at the Somatic Experiencing Trauma Institute, has shown that body-oriented practices help the nervous system complete the survival responses that were activated but could not be expressed during the abuse. Movement, slow and intentional breath, physical grounding practices, and any form of exercise that you find genuinely enjoyable all serve as vehicles for releasing the stored activation that words alone often cannot reach. Dan Siegel at UCLA has written about the window of tolerance in a way that is especially relevant here. In narcissistic abuse recovery, the window narrows substantially, meaning that the range within which you can process difficult material without either flooding or shutting down is smaller than it was. This is not permanent, but it means that the work of healing needs to happen at a pace that respects where the window actually is rather than where you wish it were. Gentle, consistent, and sustainable practices expand the window over time far more effectively than intensive approaches that push beyond the current capacity and re-traumatize rather than heal. Bruce Perry at the Child Trauma Academy has written about how relational trauma heals most effectively in relational context, meaning that the experience of being genuinely seen and responded to by another safe person is itself therapeutic in ways that solitary practice cannot replicate. You do not need to rush into new romantic connection, but safe friendships, community involvement, support groups, and therapy all provide the co-regulatory relational experiences that begin to rebuild your nervous system's template for what it feels like to be in the presence of another person without needing to be on guard. These experiences accumulate, and they matter. Judith Herman at Harvard Medical School's three-phase model of trauma recovery, safety, remembrance, and mourning and reconnection is a useful map for narcissistic abuse. Specifically, the first phase, safety, cannot be rushed. It means creating the internal and external conditions in which the nervous system can begin to settle. Stable routines, reliable sleep, consistent nourishment, physical safety, and reduced exposure to activating content. Professional support from a therapist who understands complex trauma provides structure for this phase that is very difficult to create alone, and the research consistently shows that it significantly improves outcomes. Krista Neff at the University of Texas, Austin has studied the specific way that shame responds to self-compassion practice, and her findings are particularly relevant for narcissistic abuse survivors because the abuse so consistently targeted self-worth and adequacy. Shame, unlike guilt, is not about behavior. It is about identity, and it says, "I am fundamentally flawed." Self-compassion does not try to argue with shame by insisting you are perfect. It acknowledges the pain directly and offers warmth to the part of you that is suffering. Each time you practice this, even briefly, you are building a neural counterweight to the shame that was installed by someone who needed you to feel small in order to feel large. Michael Merzenich at the University of California, San Francisco has shown that neuroplasticity is not just a feature of young or undamaged brains. The capacity for the brain to reorganize its circuitry in response to new experience continues throughout adulthood and is not diminished by prior abuse. What this means for your healing is that every new positive social interaction, every safe moment of genuine connection, every experience of being treated with consistency and care is laying down new neural pathways alongside the old ones. You are not simply trying to erase the abuse. You are building a new relational template that gradually becomes the more frequently activated one. James Pennebaker at the University of Texas, Austin has shown that writing about a painful experience, particularly when the writing has a quality of exploration rather than repetition, produces measurable psychological and physical benefits. For narcissistic abuse survivors, writing serves an additional function. It is a space where your account of events is not disputed. The page does not tell you that your memory is wrong, or your feelings are too much, or your interpretation is distorted. Whatever you write stands. Over time, the accumulation of your own undisputed account begins to rebuild confidence in your right to have a perspective on your own life. If someone in your life would benefit from having the neuroscience of narcissistic abuse recovery explained clearly, please share this video with them. And if you have a specific question about your own situation that this video has not addressed, please leave it in the comments. These questions matter, and they directly shape what videos get made next. They are often exactly the questions that dozens of other people are quietly holding. One of the more nuanced aspects of recovery is developing discernment without developing distrust. The goal is not to become someone who cannot open to other people. The goal is to develop a more reliable internal compass that can distinguish between the kinds of patterns that signal genuine care and the kinds that signal the familiar dynamics of exploitation. Dan Siegel at UCLA describes this as the integration of implicit learning, making what was once an unconscious vulnerability into a conscious and navigable awareness. You will not need to armor yourself against connection. You will simply become better at recognizing from the inside what genuine connection actually feels like. There is also grief in narcissistic abuse recovery that is often overlooked, and it is worth naming. You are not just grieving the person. You are grieving the version of them that you fell in love with during the idealization phase, which was probably one of the most intoxicating experiences of your life. You are grieving the future you imagined. You are grieving the time and energy and self that were poured into something that could not hold them. And you may be grieving something older, a need for love and safety that this relationship seemed to promise but ultimately could not meet. All of that deserves to be mourned honestly, not bypassed or minimized. Richard Tedeschi at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte has documented something that many narcissistic abuse survivors eventually discover, that what they endured, while genuinely harmful, sometimes becomes the catalyst for a quality of self-knowledge and clarity of values that they would not otherwise have developed. Not because the abuse was necessary or justified, it was neither, but because survival required them to understand themselves, their needs, and their relational patterns with a depth that the comfort of ordinary life rarely demands. That hard-won self-knowledge is real, and it belongs to you entirely. There comes a point in healing when something subtle but unmistakable shifts. The fog that has been surrounding your thoughts begins to thin. You find yourself making small decisions with a quiet confidence that was absent before. You notice you are no longer automatically scanning the faces of people you are with for signs of disapproval. You realize that a whole morning passed without the inner critic running its familiar loop. These are the quiet signs that the neuroplasticity Merzenich describes is actually happening, that the neural pathways that were conditioned by abuse are thinning from disuse, while the ones built through safety and practice are growing stronger. The fog lifting is not dramatic, but it is real. Signs of genuine healing are often quieter than the turmoil of the abuse itself. You may notice the inner critic has lost some of its authority. You may find yourself setting a small boundary without the days of guilt and anxiety that would have followed before. You may discover that your sense of your own worth has become less dependent on what others think and more rooted in your own experience of your values and your choices. These shifts are structural, not simply emotional. They represent actual changes in how your brain processes safety, threat, self, and other. They are worth acknowledging when you notice them. What you are healing from was not a character flaw that made you vulnerable. It was a fundamental human need for love and connection that was exploited by someone who knew how to use it. Your capacity to love deeply and to work hard for a relationship is not the problem. It is something that deserves to be honored, protected, and eventually offered again in a context where it can actually be received. Before you go, there is a 3D game called Inner Phoenix, and you will find it through the CR code in the description. It has quiet rooms where you can sit with what you are observing, what you feel, what you need, and what you want to try next. There is no pressure. It will be there whenever you are ready. If this video helped you understand how narcissistic abuse heals and why it takes the specific approaches it takes, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. Your support reaches people who are still in the fog and need to know the fog is temporary.